Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the Buddha, the Blessed Noble and fully self-awakened one. So what I'm hoping to do for the rest of the year is go through the whole teaching really in little short talks. And the place to start, of course, is with his declaration of the Four Noble Truths. And if you were to choose one word upon which all his teaching is based, it would have to be the word dukkha. So this dukkha just means hard to bear, and it's translated variously as suffering, dissatisfaction, discomfort, and so forth. But it really covers the whole of life. So it begins with dukkha dukkhata, which means the suffering of suffering, or the dissatisfaction of dissatisfaction. In other words, ordinary physical pain, mental anguish, etc., are just natural to the human condition. But what makes it suffering is the way we react. And it's knowing that allows us to find the escape out of suffering. So that's what we're doing when we're meditating, of course. When we're in posture, we note something coming up, a pain in the knee or something, and we note the reaction to it. And when we can stand apart from the reaction, we find ourselves in a place which is not suffering, even though the environment, the pain in the knee, and the not wanting of the pain in the knee is not pleasant. So it's making that sort of distinction when it comes to just the pains and woes of life. So even, taking something very heavy like a death, the death of somebody close to us. So a tremendous amount of grief and heart suffering. But then there's the reaction to that, which is sometimes a desire not to face it. So it remains in the system as a turbulence. And sometimes the desire to indulge it. So you get into this wrong relationship with grief where if you stop grieving, you think you've stopped loving. So, but when we sort of feel it as a feeling in ourselves, we're standing apart from it. And that separation from the reaction that we've had is the Nibbanic gap. And that's what we have to really keep rediscovering for ourselves. And of course, in these situations, the heart heals itself. Now, on the obverse side of that, of course, is everything to do with pleasure. The pleasures and joys of life. So here we have a different problem to do with indulgence. Now, what indulgence simply means is that we're using something, we're becoming dependent on something in order to be happy. Everybody has their own definition of what makes them happy, and everybody has their own particular feeling as to what happiness is. And we tend to believe that that's the purpose of our lives, to feel happy. When Sayadaw U Pandita turned up at IMS once, a woman said to him, I'm so happy to see you. And he replied in Burmese, but the translator didn't translate it. Afterwards, she went to the translator and asked, what did he say? He said, I haven't come here to make you happy, I've come here to make you aware. And that's the crucial point about the Buddha's teachings. And of course, when we do indulge, there is always consequences, the grief of loss, the anxiety of loss, paying out loads for insurance. And there's the anger, not getting what you want, the frustration of not getting what you want. And then, of course, the boredom, what used to make you happy and joyful, now you find boring. So there's a whole load of mental diseases that comes through the process of attachment, through the process of indulgence. And this is all contained in that little phrase, dukkha dukkhata. It's one type of suffering. Now, the second type is to do with impermanence. And this is basically not really coming to terms with the fact that everything arises and passes away. Not only does everything arise and pass away, nothing ever repeats. So there's actually nothing in this universe, in our lives, that we can rely upon, right? Anything can disappear at any moment. So it's coming to terms with that, which is really understanding this process of change. Now, we're especially, shall we say, fortunate in Britain because of our weather. The weather is constantly changing, and therefore we can never make absolute plans as to when you want to go for a walk, because I'm a fair weather walker, and you make a plan to walk on such a day, and of course it rains and snows, or it does everything else apart from sunshine. So this whole idea of impermanence comes across when we actually look at what we arrange sometimes, and sometimes we can't make it. And of course, at a deeper level, this whole impermanence, of course, is taking us to the whole process of aging and final death. And that's the difficult one to come to terms with, of course. But it's the quiet, gentle remembrance at all times, you know, just there, that everything comes to an end, life comes to an end. Now, you might think by reminding myself of that, I'm going to make myself depressed. But what happens is, of course, you find yourself living more in the moment. Living more in the moment, you come to appreciate the moment more. And therefore, paradoxically, your life becomes much more joyful for it. In the medieval times, of course, it was very regular to have your what was it called? Momentum, mori momentum, your reminder of death, a little skull on your death or somewhere, so that you never actually forgot that, you know, life is short. And that whole attitude of coming to terms with impermanence is part and parcel of our practice. Yeah. The final one is to do with the concept of self. The concept of self, you know, creates a substantiality, something that is real, whole, entire unto itself. But actually, when we look even a little bit deeper, we can see that everything is compounded. Everything is made up of little bits and pieces, and these little bits and pieces are dependent on other little bits and pieces. And so this whole planet, as we know, is a living organism with little bits and pieces dependent on some other little bits and pieces. And it's beginning to dissolve, beginning to deconstruct our experience of ourselves, which is part and parcel of that process. Now, we wouldn't do that, or we'd be afraid to do that, if when we actually deconstruct everything, we find there's nothing there. I mean, that would be terrible. But what the Buddha is saying is that hidden within this organism, there is something which doesn't die. It wasn't born, doesn't die. It's not even conditioned. Now, where is it? What could it possibly be? And that's the process, again, of our meditation. So this sense of self is, shall we say, the fundamental delusion that lies at the basis of all our unhappinesses. It's the point where the awareness within us begins to experience this organism as itself. That's the big point of contact. And it's right there that the whole trouble of delusion begins. And the dependent origination begins with that phrase, avidya, you know, delusion, not knowing. It's not a culpable thing, it's just the way it is. Now, how do we know? How do we know when any of these delusions are arising? How do we know, once we've sussed this out, once we've understood this, how do we know when it's activated? This is the point. How do we know when we are under the spell of these misunderstandings. So this is where the genius, you might say, or the real insight of the Buddha lies. It lies right there in our desires. So if we're aware of a desire, we'll be able to pinpoint what is causing that desire. And if it's wholesome, of course, we empower it. But if it's not wholesome, then we have to sit with that energy until it dies away. And to be aware of a desire as it rises takes that bit of appamado. It's his favorite word, one of his favorite words, which of course it's his second to last word in life. Appamado, somebody, that's right. Strive diligently for your liberation. So it's that sense of constantly bringing ourselves back to the present moment and being awake to any little desire that comes up. Most desires, are neither here nor there. There's a desire in me to wave my hand about like I'm doing now, but it's not something I'm going to be too bothered about. But if a desire is for something which I immediately perceive as unwholesome, unskillful, unvirtuous, then if I'm right there with the initial movement of that desire, the choice arises. Once I've activated it, that's it. I've lost that moment of little bit of choice. And once it's activated, then of course there are going to be results. So that second noble truth, the noble truth that desire is the cause of suffering, that's how the delusions manifest, okay? And then of course he says that there is an end to this suffering. And then finally, there's the path that he delineates, which is a bit too much for us to go into this evening. But most of you know it. It begins with right understanding, which is what we're doing now. And that, of course, changes our attitudes. And when our attitudes change, it affects the way we speak and what we do and our livelihood. So it all reverts back to this really understanding the way things are. And then through that process of not activating those desires that are unwholesome and activating those desires that are wholesome, that the attitude changes. And very slowly we pull ourselves out of the morass of human suffering. But let's go back to the third one, you see, which is, of course, there is an end to suffering. And the word he gives for that is nibbana. And it's translated in various ways. Some of it is, shall we say, creative etymology, but the two main ones are no desire and unshackled, you see, unfettered. Now, some of you will know the 10 fetters that keep us at this level of existence, and it's unfettering those that releases this awareness, which is the Buddha within. And so I'd like to end my little homily with a quote from Meichi Kiao. Now, Meichi Kiao was a Thai nun who died in 91, so she's absolutely contemporary. She was a student of Ajahn Mahabua. Some of you might know these people, might know his writings, and she worked with her. she worked with him, and then. Once she became liberated, she went back to look after her nuns. And that's what she did, really, for the rest of her life. Died when she was about 91, if I remember. And of lung cancer. So now this is what she says, which tells us how somebody who's fully liberated actually experiences life, okay? So remember, she's fully engaged. She's there with the nuns, she's, and lay people who come, but mainly her concern seems to have been to guide her nuns. So she's fully engaged in life, right? And this is what she says, which tells us how that engagement is, how it manifests. This is what she says. Body, mind, and essence are all distinct and separate realities. So there's three parts to us: the body, our physicality, our mentality, and this, what she here calls essence, right? That which is. Absolutely everything is known, right? Which means that whatever comes into the awareness, whatever arises on the screen of consciousness, she knows it. You know, her mind isn't somewhere else. Earth, water, fire, and wind. So these, remember, are your four great elements. I won't go into detail. I'm presuming you know this. Then there's feeling, the body, feeling, perceptions, conceptual thinking, and then there are the habits that we have, and finally consciousness. She knows when sounds, sights, smells, tastes, touches, and emotions arise. She knows when, now this is interesting, when greed, anger, and delusion arise. All are known. I know them as they exist in their natural states. Now, it might surprise you to think that somebody who's fully liberated still has negative, unwholesome thoughts arise. But remember, the mind is now sort of habituated in a way of thinking. But the distinction between somebody who's an arahat and us is that they are traces in the mind that have no pull, they have no attraction, and therefore they just arise and pass away. Whereas our habit, of course, is to jump and grab hold of them and off we go. And what she's saying is that these are just traces that pass through the mind. Now, no matter how much I'm exposed to them, I'm unable to detect even an instant when they have any power over my heart. And that's her next word for this Buddha within, her heart, right? It doesn't, remember, it's not the emotional heart. This isn't emotion. This is her real being. And they have no power over it. The awareness is there, right? Now, we experience that in our meditation on occasion. On occasion, when we're observing things, rising, passing away, we're in this state. We're having a little touch of nibbana. All these things arise and cease. They're forever changing. But the presence, that's the third word she uses to describe this awareness, this Buddha nature. But the presence that knows them never changes for an instant. It is forever unborn and undying. This is the end of suffering. So I've never come across a more clear statement as to how an arahat experiences life. Not even the Buddha, which may be surprising. But the Buddha has many statements about, about nibbana and about that state of mind, but I've never seen it expressed, as it were, in a way that that the ordinary meditator can grasp. So there she is, looking after her nuns, always in the moment, aware of what's actually happening. And whenever something slightly negative arises in the mind, it simply arises and passes away. It doesn't enter into her heart, into her awareness. So I'm hoping that you find that inspiring. I personally find it very inspiring. And I can only hope my words have been of some assistance, that I have not caused confusion, and that by your total devotion to the practice, you will be liberated from all suffering sooner rather than later.